This is the Best or Worst Podcast. And now, here are your hosts, Koji Stephen Sakai and M. Martin Mapoma.
All right. Welcome. This is the Best or Worst Podcast. I am Martin.
And I am Koji.
Excellent. That is Koji, and I am Martin. Yes, it is. Our society is so focused on celebrity, we sometimes forget that regular people lead interesting lives too. Best or worst moment of your life? Host Koji Stephen Sakai, who is that? And M. Martin Mapoma, that's me, are here to let your story out. We put people on the spot. What are you going to hear? It could be funny. It could be poignant. It could be sad. You'll know when we know. Best or Worst Podcast is a twice-weekly podcast. On Tuesdays, we get to know our guests, and on Thursdays, we find out their best or worst moment, and this is episode 74. Amazing.
You're supposed to start with episode number first, not at the end of that.
I know. I'm a little out of it, so
it's okay. Well,
this is my first time actually talking to people for a while.
Today is Tuesday, so we're going to be getting to know our guests, and our guest today is Ken Fong, former retired pastor, retired podcaster, and person I've known for a really, really long time, and I was lucky enough to be on his podcast. So we welcome you. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Actually, I'm not retired from podcasting. I actually kind of retired from pastoring so I can do podcasting. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Now I got nothing to do, man.
So why don't you
kind of pastor were you?
Oh, I was a pastor of a historic Japanese American church, Evergreen Baptist Church of Los Angeles, almost 100 years old, and I kind of led it to be multi-Asian, multi-ethnic, more progressive.
Great.
Did you say Baptist?
Yeah, American Baptist, not Southern Baptist.
I was raised Baptist. Raised Baptist.
Right.
Yeah, I'm from. I don't know how much you know about our background, but I was born in Zambia, Africa.
Oh.
And my parents went to a missionary church, and that missionary church was populated by missionaries from the South. So it was a Southern Baptist, church. And when I went to college, college in Kentucky.
Oh my
Southern Baptist. So I'm a recovering.
Oh, I was gonna say I'm gonna pray for Martin right now.
Yeah, I'm Catholic now. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about how you decided to, or did you always know you wanted to be a pastor, or is that something that you kind of came to later in life?
Okay, now that's a really interesting question to me, because people just assume that you always know that you're going to be a pastor, and that was the last thing I wanted to do. I grew up always going to church, this little Chinese Baptist church. It was the second oldest Baptist work among Chinese west of the Mississippi. So it was my family, my uncles, my aunties, and I dug everything. But kind of the secret message, at least when we went home, was, if you're really smart, you're not going to be a pastor. Because look who our pastors are. They're not very sharp people. And it's like, oh yeah, we're too sharp to be pastors. So yeah, I thought I was going to be a dentist or a doctor or, something like that. I majored in biology, and I had a crisis of sorts in my senior year at Cal when I realized that I didn't really want to do those things, and they didn't actually want me to come. That's called I didn't get in. Okay. So I for the first time in my life, it's like, I don't know what I'm going to be when I grow up. And so I just kind of felt like God was telling me to go home and just kind of wait. And while I was at home waiting, I'm my dad's oldest son. And so he's like, so I just paid for this college degree. And what was it again? I said, biology. So why aren't you biologizing? He made a participle out of biology. And I said, well, you don't understand, Dad. That was just to kind of fulfill prerequisites for pre-med, pre-dem. But I'm not going to do that anymore. So he says, well, you can just kind of sit around. So I just said, okay, just to make my dad happy, I took this part-time job at my home church during the summer to be the youth director, never thinking I'd be a pastor. And things just kind of took off. And in spite of me, and one of the big obstacles for me was I don't speak Chinese. and the only pastors I knew were bilingual. And then when they were hearing I was a little bit interested, like, dude, you got to go take private tutoring, and that dialect that your family speaks. like that's like hillbilly talk. I mean, like you would get laughed out of every pulpit. You can't talk like that, right? And so like, I say, hey, you know what? I'm open to a lot of things, but I said at the end of the day, I didn't grow up in Chinatown. I'm not going to pastor in Chinatown. In fact, I think what God's calling me to do is kind of all English, Chinese, Japanese blended thing. And they're like, we can't imagine that. You're wrong. And so basically I went off on my own, and I went to seminary, and whatever you call it, the rest is history.
Wow. What
there is hillbilly Chinese talk?
Yeah, let me tell you.
Well, every culture has kind of a dialect that is not that is seen as not as like Southern, for example, Southern dialect, right, is seen as less intelligent.
Yeah, yeah. So I didn't realize.
Seen as.
So I was struggling for years to understand how is our village dialect so hillbilly, right? Well, I didn't even have the term hillbilly until one day someone was explaining, as you were saying, Koji, like if you meet someone from Appalachia and they go, hi there, right? Yeah. Without knowing anything about them, you assume that they barely have teeth in their mouth and they're not smart. And they said, that's how your dialect sounds in public.
Yeah. I mean, that's like when Japanese Americans speak. A lot of the Japanese Americans, because they don't speak Japanese, when they speak, it sounds like they're uneducated, like they're speaking like in a very, very like children simplified.
Sure. I get it. I get it. It's just funny because I never thought of. I mean, with Hilton, the South. Yeah, I get it. It's just I've never thought of Chinese being hillbilly Chinese.
Hey, now I'm like, every race has them.
I know. Oh, I know they do. I just I thought about Africans in the bush. The South. I've just never thought about hillbilly Chinese or hillbilly Japanese. I guess now I'm dying to hear that dialect.
Well, you can't tell the difference. I mean, most people.
I know. I can. Yeah. I'm dying to hear it.
I mean, even in Japanese, it's like Okinawan is seen as like less than Japanese or other
really
Southern
Okinawan?
Japanese. Well, because they have a sordid history which we can't get into here, but it's like they've been part of Japan, not part of Japan. Their Japanese is different. The culture is very much a blend between Chinese and Japanese more than Japanese. But anyway, Ken, I'm really interested. One of the things that I always admired about you from afar, and when I got to know you, was that your work kind of being a very progressive pastor and really pushing the envelope. And I'm I know you've gotten backlash on some of this stuff. Why don't you tell us kind of your journey to there? Were you always progressive, or was that journey for you?
Again, you ask good questions, Koji. Again, I was raised to be a reader and a thinker. When I went off to Berkeley, I felt like that was a perfect place for me to land because they made you really stretch beyond your comfort zones, right? And at the same time, I'm living this double life because I'm growing up in this Chinese Baptist church where thinking like that's not encouraged. And without having the labels that I have now, I mean, we were kind of, and Martin, you would understand this language. We were like this, like waiting for the rapture, kind of people. Okay, all right. So it was like, okay, so we don't believe in evolution. Okay, and at the same time, I'm a biology major and I'm taking paleontology classes at Berkeley.
Ooh, that's a big no-no.
Okay, right. We believe that Noah's Ark was a real thing, and I even in my first year in seminary, I'm coming up with kind of logical research explanations for how this could be an actual thing. And finally, when I transferred to my seminary down at Fuller, Fuller was a more progressive. It wasn't a progressive school, but it had a lot more space around it. And then I started reading more progressive Christian stuff on justice. And at that time, it was anti-nuclear proliferation. And at the same time, this emerging evangelical crowd was like all in on anti-abortion. And I'm thinking, if we nuke the world, it doesn't matter whether a baby is, born or aborted. It's just like game over. And so I didn't necessarily see that as liberal or progressive. I just thought, oh, that just seems very biblical to me. But then right away, I was getting hit by people in the congregation. It's like, we don't want you sharing that left-wing stuff from the pulpit. And I'm like, anti-nuclear proliferation is left-wing stuff? I mean, I don't get it. So I kind of went a little bit more underground for a while. But at the same time, I'm reading, I'm listening, I'm meeting other people, like-minded people. Racial reconciliation became a huge thing. in some of my outside involvements. And so when our church went through this, we called it a hive in the mid 90s, where the original senior pastor and myself, we kind of let the congregation take a year to decide which of the two pastors they were going to follow. So a third of the congregation followed me and 2/3 went with him. And although we would never get into why did that happen, I think it's because he wisely saw that I wasn't as moderate as I was coming across in public, and it was kind of not as good a fit as it was when I was much younger. And we were together for 18 years. We were Batman and Robin, except now Robin was kind of casting his own shadow. And so once I became the senior pastor of this 1/3, I was more free to kind of explore in public what I was learning personally. And then ultimately, beyond the whole racial reconciliation thing, in 2007, I felt God calling me to open up our church to LGBTQ people. And and I just knew, Martin,
you're really straight from the rapture.
Oh yeah. And this is where this is going to sound very kind of mystical, but I was asleep in January 2007, and I felt God speaking to me in a dream. And this doesn't happen. I don't remember dreaming most nights. And I felt like God say, okay, so now I'm going to unpack why I've given you whatever reputation you currently enjoy. It's to spend it down before you die on a group of people that can't add to your reputation. They can only take away. And I'm like, what? And it's like, well, what group are you talking about? And God in this dream kept saying, well, that's not relevant. And I go, I think it's incredibly relevant because I'm going to go down with this group. He said, no, the only thing that's relevant is, do you think this is really God having a conversation with you? Or is this the result of eating a burrito at 11 o'clock at night? And so in my spirit, I just felt like this doesn't normally happen to me. I'm not charismatic. I'm not Pentecostal, but I really believe this is God. So I said, you know what, God, I give up. I think this is you. I don't know who you're talking about, but I'll do this. And then 3 months later, it became obvious through a couple of circumstances that the group was the LGBTQ, and especially Christian ones who were kind of spiritually homeless. And so at that time, I was the, love the sin or hate the sin sort of person, especially publicly. But I I already told God yes. And so ultimately I led my church. And this is, you guys are storytellers too. Great stories have crises, right? When you go on the hero's journey, there's something. And so I had gone on this journey already. And so I needed to create the crises for the church. And so rather than focus on what Christians call the clobber passages, the 6 or 7 Bible verses that seem to condemn homosexual behavior, I focused on the forest, not those trees. And so I said, hey, are we really actually Christians? Or are we actually more like the Pharisees in the New Testament, who were a bunch of pious stuffed shirts, who were always moralizing about everything and quoting Bible verses? But Jesus said, you're far from me, you're a bunch of snakes. And I said, I don't know about you, but I'm a recovering snake. Okay. and so anyway, that's long story short. It took me 6 or 7 years, but by the time I retired in 2017, we had started a safe group that wasn't a Pray the Gay Away group. And we probably had 75 to 100 AAPI queer and trans people coming to that group before I left. And that was remarkable to me. Now, of course, there was other people who were straight that left.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet. So you were what they would call, back in the South, you were backsliding.
Yeah. No. They would say I was a heretic.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Right.
I don't know. Some Southern Baptists don't really understand the word heretic. They know backsliding. That's a lot easier for them to understand.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, both you guys, I just pretty much had to re-ground myself that my worth doesn't come from what other people's opinion, is of me. Is my worth actually is who God thinks I am. And besides, God had told me, I'm gonna reduce your reputation. And so it's like, okay, so none of this is a surprise. Now the cool thing in retrospect is that I gained a reputation among the queer and the trans crowd, and among the more progressive people going, finally someone's willing to say what is obvious to everybody outside the church. And I think especially like our daughter's 21 and a half. I mean, her whole generation, they're like, we're not going to those churches that are homophobic.
Yeah. One of the reasons that the church that I go to here in Pasadena, the Catholic Church, I was after I left the South, I refused to go back to church because as a foreign student from Africa living in the South in the early '80s and '90s, you can only imagine, the casual cruelty that I would experience in church. I look back on it now and I thank myself for being a little bit sheltered and immature because I didn't understand the gravity of what was going on. And so to hear you talk about all this, I think back to when I was there. None of what you did it would have been shut down so fast, and you would have been tarred and feathered almost immediately. And so I refused to go to church for a good 20 years. And my wife, who was Catholic, she wanted to go back to church after we had our son. And we went to a church here in our neighborhood that ended up being a nightmare. And I was like, you know what, I'm done. And we finally went to Holy Family in South Pasadena. And the Monsignor there, the first sermon that I heard him give was very similar to what you were talking about, about being accepting of everybody. And the way he said it, accepting of everybody. And he gave a sermon once on, the LGBT community. And it just blew me away. And that's been our parish ever since, because much like how you just described, that's, I commend you. That's really amazing, because I can only imagine. And, Catholicism has its issues, but boy, being a Baptist, there, no drinking, no dancing, none of that stuff,
Yeah. So
one of the old sayings is, I don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go with girls who do.
Yeah, I remember that. Wow. Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's been, it's always really interesting because I've studied a lot of religions, and the Jesus that I read is not the Jesus that I hear about on TV
it's not.
The Jesus that I respect is not the Jesus that people tell me about when they try to convert me to something. And I'm always like, and so what I always tell people that, like I love the one that's giving money to the poor or helping the poor.
Sure.
Doesn't want money, that like doesn't judge people, that tries to go to where people are, as opposed to try to more, like you said, moralize. But I'd love to hit on one more subject before we move on to the next episode, which is, one of the things that I found really fascinating with you also is that you're always on the cutting edge. And one of the cutting edge things you do is podcasting. I remember, I think the first time I was ever on your show, I didn't even know what podcasts were. And now everybody does podcasts, right?
Yeah,
everybody has a podcast. And so I think that's really interesting. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast and a little bit about how it all kind of started for you?
I want to hear that episode where you asked about that.
Well, he didn't ask on the episode. I had a friend who was coming to our church at the time, lives on the West Side. He's also a filmmaker. And when I started this journey with the church on the LGBTQ+, he was still at our church. And he says, even though I'm finishing my first independent film, I have to film this. We have to make this movie. And I'm like, okay, well, Koji, you especially know how those things can go. Right? It's like, okay, we need more money, or are we done yet? Right? So it had been like 5 years since we raised our initial nest egg, right? And we had kind of done most of the shooting, but we hit some snags. And so we had this downtime. And so his name is Christopher Wong. And so he says, hey, Ken, there's a thing called podcasts. Do you listen to podcasts? I go, no. I think I know what they are. They're like kind of radio shows on the internet, right? And he goes, yeah, I think you should do a podcast. And I said, why? He says, well, a couple of reasons. Number one, generally, I don't know that of the podcasts that are currently out there, there's a place for Asian American voices. And now there's, wonderfully proliferation, this show included. And he goes, number two, you already kind of have a national rep among some people on a lot of these Asian American issues. And then number three, I think when it's appropriate for the right guest, you can add a light dusting of spiritual talk, right? Which also is kind of maybe interesting.
The light dusting.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so he says, look, I'll handle the whole technical side. I'll be the director. I'll edit everything, and in those days, we'd only do it live. And so he would come from the West Side. He would sit there and sit behind the guest, and he would write me questions and shove them to me and that kind of stuff. But eventually, that drive from the West Side was kind of too much of a hassle. And we've been pumping out a weekly show. I take my hat off, you guys doing it twice a week. Since then, so we're up to our 275th episode. And I'll tell you this is my favorite thing to say about the podcast. So 2 years before I retired, I realized that doing the podcast is the one space in my life where I can sound like I really sound without the fear of someone firing me. Right? Because we're not asking money for anybody. This is our money that, that's doing this. It'd be nice if we did have some sponsors. But ultimately, it's like, wow, you could be an adult in this world and go your entire adult life and never actually say what you're really thinking. Yeah. And as I saw some friends with bigger ambitions than me, they've become, I've been on boards and stuff like that. They become a trustee of some organization, or they're some senior pastor now or something. And now you ask them what they think about LGBTQ or Black Lives Matter, and they're just dancing, right? All it is like, I represent more than myself now. I was like, you know what? I don't. Yeah. And so I'm like, man, this is a gift for me to, my brain cells still work sort of, to have a space where I can actually talk to people I enjoy talking to. And we get into things and I say things that I'm really thinking instead of always censoring. And it's just like, man, I totally dig that.
Do you get asked a lot about the, go ahead, Koji.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that kind of being able to say whatever you want is something that's, I think, really important, because I remember when I worked at the Japanese American National Museum and when I was vice president there, I couldn't say half the things I want to say because I would piss off somebody somewhere, some board member,
some Texas, donor.
Who was really conservative and making it seem like the museum is super liberal. Right. And I got in trouble a lot, and I had to really censor myself a lot. And I remember getting in fights with artists who were clearly on the same side of things, but because I can't come out and say it, they thought I wasn't. And I remember just being super frustrated about that, that that dichotomy of who I am versus
totally.
Even. And the funny thing is, even if it wasn't officially Janum project, it didn't matter. Right. I still represented Janum, just be who I was at the time. And now that I'm not there as much, or I'm not there in the position that I was, it doesn't really matter anymore. Nobody cares what I think in terms of Janum. But sorry, Martin, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to ask Ken his opinion on Black Lives Matter. Because especially because I'm already completely fascinated with your whole story, and I say that because of my again, because of the background that I was raised in. Because I tell you what, I could tell you some stories about growing up in living in Kentucky and going to one of the biggest Baptist churches there. And this thing was a monster, and I've always said I wanted to do something about it. Anyway, so hearing about I'm very curious to hear what your feelings are on Black Lives Matter and the LGBTQ community.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think a big term these days is intersectionality, right? And so you can't just talk about a issue without it intersecting with some other issues. So sexuality and gender identity a lot of times crosses over into race, right, and class and socioeconomic, all that kind of stuff. I feel like the murder of George Floyd actually was a wake-up call for a lot of non-Black people. I mean, you Black folks, they knew all this stuff was going on. It was only when cell phones were invented with reliable video capabilities that they could record what was happening to them, right? So for a lot of folks, and I think especially white folks, even some Christian white folks, I call it the bullshit moment of waking up. Like, they waking up to their own bullshit, right? And they're like, oh my God. I mean, I saw this one movie. It was a documentary film made maybe about 10, 15 years ago. Someone sent it to me. And it was about this kind of extended white family in the Northeast. They're very Episcopalian and a lot of priests and blah, blah, blah. And one of them was a seminary student, and it heard that one of their ancestors before the Revolutionary War was involved with the slave trade somewhat. So she kind of wanted to look into it and found out he was the #1 slave trader in the Northeast. Okay, and she was appalled. So she called bullshit on her family. Okay, and so only 5 of her extended family, some she'd never met, decided to go and do the slave triangle with her, and they went to Ethiopia or whatever. And they're standing in, and before they went, there's this one white male relative from Oregon. He's clearly Republican, and he's like, "Hey, you know what? We can't judge with 21st century, thinking our ancestors, because we don't know what it was like back then, and maybe owning and selling." Yeah, so he was making that whole argument, And now they're standing in the room where their ancestor used to mass all these captured Africans, thousands at a time, before they put them on the ships. And he's standing there and he calls bullshit on himself. Right. And he's like,
Wow.
oh, there's no excuse. This is evil. Like, this is wrong. So I am so impacted by that scene because I thought the murder of George Floyd was the same kind of moment for a lot of white Americans.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like, okay, no, this is evil. It's wrong. So I feel I've been part of AAPIs for Black Lives Matter. You know, I've gone to protests and prayer vigils and stuff like that. So yeah, I feel like this is a time, you know, it's going to take, unfortunately, more time for things systemically to really improve, right?
Yeah.
But I think clearly there's a lot more, and having a racist in the White House for the last 4 years. So forgive me if some of your listeners don't like that, but who cares? You know, I mean, I think that's made it even more plain. And, you know, I was deeply disturbed. I don't know about you guys on election night when I saw the initial returns coming in. It's like, how is it more people are voting for a racist, not less? So you know, I'm also a pragmatist, Martin. I know that you got to deal with what you got.
You know what? Yeah, I am too. And think about, I'm a pragmatist only by experience. When people were like, "I'm so shocked that people voted," I'm like, "No, I'm not shocked." They're like, "Can you believe this many people vote for Trump?" I'm like, "Yeah, I can. I see them every day."
Wow.
You know, same thing with Black Lives Matter. You know, people. You know, people who try to mask their resentment for Black Lives Matter, I sniff them out in a second.
Yeah.
I don't even argue with people anymore. If people don't like Black Lives Matter, and people that I know in my circle, I've quietly pushed them to the side.
Oh yeah.
Because I don't even bother to argue. I really don't. But yeah, it's true.
Yeah, and
Trump
for me,
got 70 million people. They're shocked. I'm like, nope.
Well,
that's what it is.
He still got his butt kicked.
And that actually, sorry, real quick. I'm sorry, Coach, and I'll stop. And that's what pisses a lot of people that I know off. When they say to me, "Can you believe that many people voted for Trump?" I'm like, yeah, I can. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I think one of the things you said, you know, in terms of like people coming to that moment, I just wish more Asian Americans would come to that moment. I mean, I think too many Asian Americans, because we're in this weird place as being like, I mean, sorry, I'm also talking specifically about East Asians, where we're like kind of seen not as minorities
segregation
because of we're seen as successful and wealthy.
I'm kidding. Yeah.
Whereas like you know, so on some level we're not a person of color, but then we're, you know, so a lot of times a lot of people I know, they think that they're white and they think they have the privileges of being white, but you know, when push comes to shove, you know, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II is a really great example of that we're not part of that.
Well, even, you know, Koji, even the Kung Flu, the China virus, right? All that kind of stuff. I mean, one of my Chinese American buddies, we have the same conversation when we go riding, and he refers to these kind of white wannabe East Asian Americans, and he goes, you know, they think they're in the house, but they're still the house N-word.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, they are.
Yeah, it's like
they're the Uncle Toms. They're the Uncle Toms.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
You know, they're like, you're not sick, boss. We sick. You know, that whole attitude. You know, and yeah, this has been great. I can't wait to do the next episode.
Yeah, definitely. So,
Coach, you want to lead us out?
Yeah, go ahead. Thank you, Ken.
No, go ahead, lead us out.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Martin, for this episode. It's been great. We're gonna come back on Thursday where we're gonna ask Ken his best or worst moment, and so please come back to listen in 2 days. And we're asking everybody for this episode to make sure to subscribe to this podcast, even if you're watching it on YouTube. You know, it's not a natural place to subscribe to our podcast, so go on wherever you normally download your podcast. Go there. Subscribe to this podcast, and then make sure to tell a friend about it. So thank you, Ken.
Please do.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Peace out.